Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're joining us from. We have another CTF Reveal today. It's part of the Wizer Secure Code training. We have this CTF challenges where developers get to hack code. This one is a simple one today that we are revealing. Just to remind the audience, every 2 weeks we publish a new one that is active and people can try to hack it and get into the leaderboard. And every 2 weeks when we release a new one, we retire one. So this is a retire challenge. So we're going to reveal the solution. If you want to try to solve any live CTFs, you can just go into wizer-ctf.com and go to the latest challenge, and there are many there. So with that said, let's get to it. Itzik, explain to us what is the challenge, what needs to be done, and then how to solve it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a simple code. The goal is to get the companies, the entire set of companies, the list, the entire full list from the API. So there's one endpoint here. That's the endpoint. It's, companies endpoint, where what it does, there's a MongoDB here behind the scenes. Based on the company ID, we select the company that is requested and retrieve it as a record. Stringify as a string, doesn't matter. Okay, so that's what the function does. However, to make sure that there's no NoSQL injection here, which is a vulnerability, the developer did think about it and created a function isValid to check that the company ID is indeed not dangerous. So this is the isValid function, and it went through. It goes through all the keywords, not really keywords, operators that MongoDB has that could be dangerous, like not equal, equals, not, in, and so on and so forth, listed everything that the developer thought could be dangerous. While, if one of them exists, it's not valid, and then the query actually won't happen. And so we're protecting ourselves from NoSQL injection. So far?
Cool, yeah. So it's a simple query, basically selects a specific company based on an idea and an ID, and the developer was smart enough to create an isValid function that verifies that there's no SQL injection. Basically, that's
Exactly.
the intent. So
However,
he did think about it. He did think about it. It's or she. It doesn't. It's not like they were careless.
Right. True. Okay. However, doing it this way is actually calling for trouble. Why am I saying that? Because you can forget stuff. In this case, if you don't go thoroughly through the operators, regex is somewhere else. It's not where those are in the documentation, and you miss it. So I'm already implying that the solution here is to use a regex, which allows you to actually get more than you're supposed to be able to get, right? So if I go straight into the answer, okay, that's solving it. Why is that solving it? Because regex is not being removed or invalidated, right? And hence it's allowed. And I can put a regular expression here, even empty, by the way. I could put an empty regular expression and it will work as well. But this one is simple. Any string, uppercase, lowercase, is actually going to the server and giving me all the companies that I have in the database. Okay, so that's a simple solution. However, I think, solving it is one thing, but also understanding deeply what's the message here is even more important, right? Because we've seen so many cases where we're trying to kind of like, okay, block just the things that we think we understand the vulnerability in depth. And it's really important to focus on the best practices and understand how to block things like that, right? That's why we have trainings that actually go through those things. The best way to go about it, by the way, here, to block it, is to check if it's an object or not. If the query argument, company ID, is an object, because it's nested in MongoDB, it could contain dangerous things that we don't want. This could have been a simpler function that does much better validation, okay? So always use best practices. Make sense?
Yeah. Here's something that I want to test. I want to show the audience what happens when we take this and put it into ChatGPT? Will it find, because a lot of times, companies are dependent on scanners looking for that single line that tells the developer, bing, bing, you have an issue, right? And both of us, we say all the time, look, they did sanitize the code. So it's not about code not, parameters not being sanitized. It is. It just hasn't been done right.
Exactly.
So,
and that's what scanners miss typically. So if we go to ChatGPT and we ran it just before, going live, and here's the code here, and ChatGPT did identify the code very well. So it was able to tell the story. There's an API accepting company ID. The isValid function validates company ID input, aiming to prevent NoSQL injection, which is exactly what the developer thought. And the security analysis go through it and explains it and so forth. You will probably get recommendations on how to do it in different ways. But the main important thing that I think Gabby is alluding to and pointing out is that the ChatGPT and NoScanner will be able to actually in a detailed way tell you where exactly the problem is. Okay, and it might recommend better ways, and it could do that 100 times. Okay, in our report, our report can contain a lot of noise of things like that, kind of like telling us, hey, well, you can do it more securely this way. But the nice thing here is to look at and to identify is that ChatGPT and other scanners, by the way, same AI capabilities, won't be able to tell you this is a red flag. And here we do have a red flag.
Actually, if anything, first of all, it's impressive that it followed the thought process of the developer. So it's basically, it's smart. It tells you basically what it's sort of equivalent to the developer. It's saying, hey, developer, you added the isValid function, which is great, and you try to protect against SQL injection. So if anything, it's actually telling a story of how the developer tried to avoid SQL injection. So let's go back to the code. And we wanted to show you this because it's so important for developers to think like an attacker and develop secure code practices, because if we start to rely on scanners, basically we're creating a false sense of security, because many times those scanners will just follow the thought process, or they will start advising about everything under the sun. And basically it just comes down to like doing nothing. And a lot of scanners have too much noise, and then it's sort of like a sim, like too much noise, and then you end up missing the important stuff. So you really want to write secure code from the get-go and not come up with stuff on your own, which is what the developer did here. They thought they did the right thing, but it didn't work out.
Exactly.
So let's go to the key takeaways.
Yes, the key takeaway, one of them is just avoid making up your own sanitization validation, right? There's always a better way to sanitize. In this case, company ID should always be, UUID. So you can just validate that it's a UUID. The other way to think about it is just make sure whenever you're doing NoSQL, that the parameter, if it needs to be singular, that it's singular and it's actually a string. If it's not a string, it could be an object and nested, and that's a big problem for NoSQL. The other thing is always prefer allow list versus deny list. We talked about it multiple times. It's not the first time we're saying that, but in this case as well, we're trying to say, no this, no this, no, we kind of like go through a list, what shouldn't happen. And we should focus on what should happen, or what are the minimal cases that it should work for, okay? And in this case, by the way, it's just a validation here. I want it to be, the company ID. I just want to make sure that it's a UUID, and that's it. Nothing else should happen, okay? So that's the whitelist approach. It's two different ways to say the same thing.
And what about making sure, in this case, making sure it's an object and not a string, for example?
So yeah, making sure it's an object and not a string is probably part of the first takeaway. In this case, it's not even necessary, because not only it can't be an object, it needs to be a UUID. So it's even more deep. That's a good point what you're saying here. The general approach would be every NoSQL injection, I can just make sure that it's not an object. How do I do that? I just check the type. If it's a string or not, I have it as JSON, right? If it's a string or not, I can just check the type. That would block that as well, by the way. However, in this case, I go even narrower. The recommendations here say that not only it's a string, it's also specifically a specific type of string, which is a UUID. And if I regex that, nothing will slip.
Gotcha.
Okay? It's exactly a UUID.
Cool. So great. This is the solution. I think some very important key takeaways. And again, I advise all of you that are watching this, you can have your developers, your dev team, go into wizer-ctf.com. It's a community edition, and they can play and win prizes when we have tournaments. It's actually really fun. There's a big community, and it's growing. We have also a Discord server, so you can learn from others. And within the Wizer product, for companies that want this internally, and then they want to see progress, how the team is making progress from learning and playing this, then you can just sign up to Wizer, and the CTF platform is also there, and you can do private tournaments just for your team. With that said, Itzik, thank you very much, and we will meet next week to continue revealing CTFs.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Take care.